Well, when I was a kid, there was this corner that was behind and between a couple buildings where leaves and small papers would blow into that corner and just blow in circles. And I remember as a kid just sitting there and watching those things blow in circles. And they would just go around and around and around. And I remember just watching them go around and around. And the wind would blow them into the corner, and they'd get trapped in there, and then they'd just keep blowing, and they'd get caught in this endless cycle. And sometimes a piece of paper would kind of blow up a wall, and it would look like it was going to escape. It was going to get out of that corner and continue on, but then it would fall back down and just keep blowing around in circles. Sometimes people are like those papers. The winds of the world, the winds of worldly ways, blow them into the corner and trap them so they're going nowhere. They're just running in circles. And they do things that they think will help them, or they think will make them happy, or they think will help them get ahead. And sometimes it looks like they are. But they're still trapped. They're going nowhere. Today we're going to see two kings. One of them is a lot like that person we just described. He's not following God. He's just doing his own thing. And he's just caught. He's not getting ahead. The other is committed to God. He's living to please God, and he's fulfilling his purpose in life. So we're going to be in 2 Chronicles 27-28 this morning. But first, I want to give you just a little review of where we've come from as we've studied to get up to this point. Now, back when we studied the book of Samuel, we met David. David was the great king of Israel. God chose David to be king. David was devoted to God, and God made a covenant with David and his descendants that he would have a forever dynasty. Now, this is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, who is king forever. But David was a good king. But we know he didn't do everything right. In fact, he committed some serious sins. But David confessed those sins, and he sought to get right with God. He sought to live right before God and to honor God with his life, and his heart was devoted to God. Now then his son Solomon was made king. And just before David died, he gave Solomon a charge. He told Solomon to be faithful to God and to serve him with his whole heart. He also told him to build the temple. So Solomon did that. He built the temple. Let me back up. But the main point that David was telling Solomon is that God is what matters most. Your relationship with God is what's most important. So Solomon started very well. He asked God for wisdom in order to rule well, and then God blessed him because he was faithful to God. Solomon built the temple, but he also made a few choices that brought problems. The biggest of those is that in his later years, he joined his foreign wives in worshiping idols. And the Bible tells us that his wives turned his heart away from God. He was living to please his wives rather than God. Well, his son Rehoboam became king. And Rehoboam made a dumb decision. There's no better way to say it. He made a dumb decision. And the kingdom, the nation, was divided into two kingdoms. So now you had 10 of the tribes of Israel in the north that made up the northern kingdom, and they were continued to be called Israel. And then you had in the south, you had the tribe of Judah, and they became the kingdom of Judah. Well, though most of the nation had been taken away from Rehoboam and David's descendants would still be king in Judah because God had promised David that he would always have a dynasty. And so God keeps his promises. But under Rehoboam, idolatry began to grow in Judah. Well, in the southern kingdom, in Judah, the kings were kind of a mixed bag. I mean, these descendants of David were generally faithful to God. Some of them mostly or very faithful to God, and some of them not. But in general, they were better than the kings in the north. In the northern kingdom, in Israel, God made Jeroboam the king. But he immediately introduced idolatry. He introduced this new mixed religion where he took the truth of Yahweh, of the true God, of Israel's God, and he made idols and said, well, these are your gods, the one who delivered you from Egypt. And he also built new temples there in the north. Then all of the kings in Israel, in the northern kingdom, after him, followed in his ways. But they got worse and worse, and they started worshiping other idols as well. Eventually, Ahab became king. Now, Ahab was just flat out evil. In fact, he's described here in the Bible as he did more evil than any other before him. And Ahab, he married Jezebel. And Jezebel, she was a fully committed worshiper of the false god Baal. And together, she and Ahab, they pushed Baal worship in Israel. And they even killed God's prophets. It was during Ahab's reign that there was that contest between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal, which was really a contest between Yahweh, the true God, and Baal, and which was really not a contest at all. It was obvious that Yahweh is the true God, the real God. Well, during that same time period in Judah, there was a guy named Asa. He became king, and he stood out as a good king. He followed God. He trusted God. He was faithful to God, and he carried out many reforms in Judah. But he didn't finish well. And then his son Jehoshaphat became king, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. So we see we got a lot of back and forth going on here in Judah in the southern kingdom. But back in the north, Ahab's son Ahaziah became king, and he looked for help from Baal rather than God in his time of greatest need, and it didn't work out, and he died. And so his brother Joram replaced him. And we're told of one good thing that he did. He tore down the pillar or the idol of Baal. But he continued in the idolatry, in the twisted religion of Jeroboam. Now, around that time, the prophet Elijah was taken to heaven, and he was replaced by Elisha. Elisha also did great miracles and led people to follow God like Elijah did. And in this time, we see that God continued to care for the faithful and the humble, but he condemned the hard-hearted and idolatrous. Well, then Jehu took the throne in the northern kingdom by force, but he took the throne. He killed all of Ahab's family, and he ended Baal worship in Israel. But he was still unfaithful to God, and he continued the twisted religion of Jeroboam. But in Judah, in the south, Jehoram became king. And he killed all his brothers, so there was no rival to the throne. He killed all his brothers, though God's word says they were better than, or more godly than he was. He also married evil Ahab's daughter, and then became like Ahab. He was evil. And we're told clearly he was not like his ancestor David. Who am I talking about here? Joram. I know there's a lot of information here. Stay with me here. But Joram, he died, and his son Ahaziah became king. He was also evil, and he was king for only 1 year. So his mom, which was Ahab's daughter, made herself queen. And she was very evil, and she tried to kill every descendant of David. So everyone in David's line. But one survived. The priest kept Joash alive and hidden until he was 7 years old. And when he was 7 years old, they made him king. And the priest then led the people to recommit to God. And Judah was reformed. And Joash was faithful to God, at least until the priest died. But after the priest died, he then followed bad advice. He was influenced wrongly by those around him, by his peers, and he turned from God. Now, at this point, both in Israel and in Judah, they go through several kings, and they face conflict with each other and with other nations, like Moab and Edom and Syria and Egypt and Assyria. And God continues, he helps them when they rely on him. And sometimes he helps them just because he's keeping his promise. But God also uses these foreign nations to discipline them in order to teach them to be faithful to him. But the northern kingdom, Israel, they go downhill quick. At first, they're a little faithful and a little, or we could say a lot, not faithful. But then they dive deep into idolatry, and the kings refuse to listen to God. And Judah in the south, they degrade slower, and the kings are a mixed bag. They're a mix of good and bad. And this is where we pick it up here. Israel is doing evil, and Judah is inconsistent. And God is calling them to himself, and he is pursuing them in love, and he is warning them through the prophets. So that brings us up to speed. Now let's read about a good king. 2 Chronicles 27 and verse 1. Jotham was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jerusha, and the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done, except he did not enter the temple of the Lord. But the people still followed corrupt practices. Now, he mentions Uzziah here, so let's talk about Uzziah for a minute. Jotham's father, Uzziah, was a good king. He was faithful to God, and he was very successful. During his reign, Judah prospered. The nation of Judah prospered, and God blessed them. But 10 years before his death, Uzziah became prideful, and he looked at all of his accomplishments, and he decided that he should have the right to go into the temple and offer burned incense before God in the temple. Well, this was only the priests were allowed to do that. But he went in and tried to do it anyways. In his pride, he wanted to make the rules rather than listen to God's rules. And so as he's standing in the temple, the priests, they confront him, and Uzziah gets mad at them. He's angry with them. And then God strikes Uzziah with leprosy. And Uzziah spent the last 10 years of his life in quarantine, separated from other people. And during those 10 years, those last 10 years of his life, Jotham, his son, began ruling as a co-regent along with his father, Uzziah. So Jotham, he was also a good king. He was faithful to God. In fact, he lived like his father, except he didn't dishonor God by repeating that arrogant choice. But even though Jotham was faithful to God, he either did not or he was not able to lead the people to be faithful. And so we have this mix of good and bad in Judah, but at the same time, in Israel, in the northern kingdom, there's a lot of evil and unrest. In fact, 2 Kings, you don't have to turn there, but 2 Kings 15 tells us what's happening right now in the northern kingdom. There's a guy named Shallum who is king for only 1 month when he's murdered by Menahem. Menahem makes himself king, and then he kills the people who didn't welcome him. But then he has to take money from the wealthy and to pay off the king of Assyria in order to support him and strengthen his position. And then when he dies, his son is king for 2 years, but he's conspired against and killed by Pekahiah, who was the son of one of the king's leading men. So a lot of conspiracy. And then while Pekahiah is king, Assyria attacks Israel and carries off people as captives. And then another guy named Pekah, he conspires against the king and kills him and becomes king himself. And so the thing that stands out in the history of Israel in this time period is that it's a mess in Israel. I mean, and why is it a mess? Well, we're told it's because they all did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So back to Judah and to King Jotham. Look at verse 3, 2 Chronicles 27, verse 3. It says, he built the upper gate and the house of the Lord, and he did much building on the walls of Ophel. Moreover, he built cities in the hill country of Judah and forts and towers on the wooded hills. He fought with the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against them. And the Ammonites gave him that year 100 talents of silver and 10,000 cores of wheat and 10,000 of barley. The Ammonites paid him the same amount in the second and third years. So Jotham became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. Now the rest of the acts of Jotham and all his wars and all his ways, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And Jotham slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. And Ahaz his son reigned in his place. And so this is all we have, is just this little short summary about Jotham. And we already heard that he did what was right in the sight of God. And now we're told of his achievements. And basically, he built up Judah's defenses, both in Jerusalem and out in the country. And Judah became stronger under his rule. Also, he won battles against Judah's enemies. During this time, the Ammonites, they were subject to Judah because they had come and fought against Judah and were beaten by them. And so then the Ammonites, they brought large amounts of tribute to Jotham for 3 years. But why was Jotham so successful? We were told in those verses that we read too. It was because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. Now, if we remember back, God had promised Israel that when he made this covenant with them, he had promised that if you obey me, I will bless you. So that he promised that if they were faithful to him, if they obeyed him, he would bless them, he would protect them, he would prosper them. Well, Jotham, the king, was faithful to God, and God is keeping his promise. But let's talk about this statement again. It said that he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. Now, this is saying that he was determined to do what was right in God's sight. He was purposeful about it. This verb here that's translated as he ordered, as in he ordered his ways, he ordered, it means to arrange or fix or establish. And it has the idea of determine or prepare. And so he determined to live right before God. He decided to follow God, and he did it. He knew what God wanted, and he set out to live that way. He knew what honored God, and he purposed to live for God's honor. He wanted to please God, so he lived to please God. Now, this reminds me of Joshua's challenge. Before he died, he told the people of Israel, he said, choose today whom you will serve. Are you going to serve God or not? You see, if you don't determine to follow Jesus, you won't. If you don't purpose to live for God, you won't. If you don't order your way of life to be obedient to God and to serve him, you won't. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about willpower here. And I'm not saying that you can be godly or obedient on your own if you just set your mind to it. I mean, we need the Holy Spirit's help. But if you don't decide to follow Jesus, if you don't determine to live in fellowship with God, you won't. The winds of the world will just blow you their way. You won't. Commit yourself to living right in the sight of God. Now, sadly, the next king doesn't do this. And he's a terrible king. Chapter 28, verse 1. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. So right off, we're told of Ahaz's character. It's the opposite of his father. He didn't live to please God. He didn't obey God. But it's interesting that he's not compared or contrasted here to his immediate father. He's contrasted to David, his ancestor David. You see, David is held up as the example of a godly king. Of course, we know of David's failures, but this doesn't mean that the good kings who lived like David were perfect. But they generally obeyed, and when they didn't, they confessed their sins, and they were restored to fellowship with God, and they lived to honor God. David had a heart that was truly devoted to God, but Ahaz doesn't. He doesn't live the same way as David. He doesn't fit the character of a descendant of David, doesn't fit the character of a king of Judah. But you know what? Sometimes children don't live in the ways of their parents. As sad as it is, very godly parents can have a child that doesn't follow God. Look at verse 2. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom. He even made metal images for the Baals, and he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. So instead of living like David, Ahaz, he lived in the sinful ways of the kings of Israel. He lived like his relatives up north, who refused to obey and refused to trust God and refused to worship him alone. In fact, Ahaz, he set up idols and he worshiped false gods, and he sacrificed on the high places and under trees. And this refers to his idolatry and to syncretism, or a mixing of right and wrong forms of worship. And so he was influenced by people around him, and he adopted their pagan practices. And on top of that, we're told he even sacrificed some of his sons to those false gods. Now, child sacrifice was one of the great evils of the Canaanites, the people who lived in the land before Israel came in, when God judged them when he sent Israel in to conquer the land. But child sacrifice was used in divination, or seeking answers or direction from a god. And child sacrifice, it was used as the ultimate sacrifice to try to gain the support of a god in a desperate situation. And God told them, never do it. But all in all, Ahaz is more like a king of Israel than a king of Judah. He's ungodly, and he does great evil before God. Verse 5. Therefore the Lord his God gave him into the hand of the king of Syria, who defeated him and took captive a great number of his people and brought them to Damascus. He was also given into the hand of the king of Israel, who struck him with great force. For Pekah, the son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 from Judah in one day, all of them men of valor, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. And Zikri, a mighty man of Ephraim, killed Messiah, the king's son, and Azakam, the commander of the palace, and Elkanah, the next in authority to the king. The men of Israel took captive 200,000 of their relatives, women, sons, and daughters. They also took much spoil from them and brought the spoil to Samaria. And so, just as God kept his promise and blessed Jotham for his obedience, God now keeps his promise to discipline. And he sends Syria and then Israel against Judah because they had turned from God. And so first Syria came down and they attack Judah and defeat them. And after winning that battle, they take many people from Judah home as prisoners to their capital, Damascus. Now, God had warned people about the possibility of exile, of being taken out of the land that he had given them if they were not obedient, if they were not faithful to him. And the prophets have been reminding them of these things. So when a bunch of their people were taken, this should have made them stop and think and turn back to God and be faithful to him. But they don't. So then Israel comes down, the northern kingdom. They come down and they attack Judah. And we're reminded here that it happened because Judah had turned from God. But Israel attacks them brutally and wipes out a huge number of their relatives. They kill 120,000 people from Judah in one day. And so Judah's army is decimated. Then we learn that Ahaz's son was killed, and who was probably going to be the next king. And then also Ahaz's next in command was killed. And so the leadership of Judah has suffered great loss. And then on top of all that, Israel captured 200,000 people from Judah as prisoners and took them back to Samaria, to the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And they took a lot of spoil as well, and they took a bunch of their stuff. And so Judah has now become a lot weaker and a lot poorer. But now, notice that it specifically says that Israel took 200,000 of their relatives, or brothers, depending on your translation, but 200,000 of their relatives. This is significant. We'll see this in the next verses. Look at verse 9. But a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded. And he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria and said to them, "Behold, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. And now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah and Jerusalem, male and female, as your slaves. Have you not sins of your own against the Lord your God? Now hear me and send back the captives from your relatives whom you have taken, for the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you." So the king returns home. He's victorious with his army and has all the spoil of war and many captives, and he's met by a prophet. You see, the king's pretty proud of himself here, but he's immediately confronted by the prophet. And first, the prophet points out that the reason he was able to defeat Judah and the reason God sent them there was that God was angry with Judah. God was using them to discipline Judah. But then the prophet continues and he says, "But you took it too far." Because they had killed the people of Judah in a rage. In other words, they acted viciously. They brutally killed so many without any restraint. And God took notice of it. Not only that, but now they have brought back people from Judah to be their slaves. Now, remember how they were specifically called relatives earlier? Well, again, the prophet also says, you've brought your relatives to be slaves. You see, they're all descendants of Abraham. They may have been divided into two kingdoms at this point in time, but they're family. And in Leviticus, God had told them not to enslave their relatives. Then the prophet points out that they, the people of Israel, that they're sinners too. They've done wrong before God too. They haven't been obedient to God either. And so they are in danger of God sending someone against them in judgment for their own sins. And so they may have been the instrument of God's discipline on Judah, but they went overboard and they have disobeyed God in the process on top of what they've already done. And now God is angry with them. So he tells the king, you need to send these people back to Judah. Send your relatives back home. Verse 12. Certain chiefs also of the men of Ephraim, Azariah, the son of Johanan, Berechiah, the son of Meshillemoth, Jehezekiah, the son of Shallum, and Amasa, the son of Hadlai, stood up against those who were coming from the war, and said to them, You shall not bring the captives in here, for you propose to bring upon us guilt against the Lord in addition to our present sins and guilt. For our guilt is already great, and there is fierce wrath against Israel. And so the prophet wasn't the only one to speak up against this wrong. Some of the leading men of Israel, they see what's happened and they stand up against it. They stop this procession that's coming to Samaria, and they don't allow them to bring the prisoners into Samaria. You see, they know it's wrong, and they know that God will find them guilty of this sin on top of their other sins. And they're afraid that God will bring judgment against them. And so they say, enough is enough. This is going too far, and they put a stop to it. Verse 14. So the armed men left the captives and the spoil before the princes and all the assembly. And the men who had been mentioned by name rose and took the captives, and with the spoil they clothed all who were naked among them. They clothed them, gave them sandals, provided them with food and drink, and anointed them, and carrying all the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kinfolk at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then they returned to Samaria. And so the army leaves all the people and all the stuff there. The men, they go and they clothe everyone who is missing clothes or sandals, and they feed them, and they give them medical care, and they take them all back to Judah. And those who are too weak, they let them ride on donkeys. They take them to Jericho, which is in the northern part of Judah. So now they're back in Judah, but they didn't go so far into Judah that they were going to be in danger of suffering repercussions if the army found out some people from Israel had come. But they also, there in Jericho, there's a lot of open space for this big group of people. But these men, they did what was right. They did the right thing. They even stood up to the army. And I think they're a good example here for us. Take a stand against sin. Do what's right and take a stand for what's right. Even if the powerful are not. Even if your leaders are not. No matter who isn't, you stand for God. Stand for his truth. Stand for God's ways. Verse 16. At that time, King Ahaz sent to the king of Assyria for help.
For the Edomites had again invaded and defeated Judah and carried away captives. And the Philistines had made raids on their cities in the Shephelah and the Negev of Judah, and taken Beth Shemesh and Aijalon and Gederoth and Socoh with its villages, Timnah with its villages, and Gimzo with its villages, and they settled there. For the Lord humbled Judah because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he had made Judah act sinfully and had been very unfaithful to the Lord. So in spite of these friendly actions by these leading men of Israel, Ahaz takes steps to protect himself and his people because they're in pretty bad shape. They've already been beaten up by Israel, and they've been beaten up by Syria to the north. And then the Edomites, they invade them from the southwest or southeast, and they took more captives away. And then the Philistines attacked from the west, and they took cities away from Judah. And so Judah, they're getting beat up, and they're losing people, and they're losing territory, and they're getting weaker and weaker. So Ahaz asks the king of Assyria for help. Now remember, there's Syria and there's Assyria. Okay? Syria is a little farther to the northeast. But he asked the king of Assyria for help. And at this time, the Assyrians, they are a growing empire, and they have a lot of strength. But the key statement here is in verse 19. It explains why all of this has happened. Why are they so weak? Why are they so vulnerable right now? It's because God has come against them and has humbled them because of Ahaz's and the nation's, or the kingdom's sin, Judah's sin. Ahaz has led the people in disobeying God. They are unfaithful to him. They are following the sinful ways of the world around them, the people around them, rather than obeying God. And ironically, God's actions here are meant to discipline them and bring them to repentance. And Ahaz should have recognized the error of his ways, and that he got them into this mess. And then he should have gotten right with God and put his trust in God. But instead, he continues in his sinful ways, and he puts his trust in another man rather than turning to God for help. He turns to another man. Verse 20. So Tiglath-Pileser, a king of Assyria, came against him and afflicted him instead of strengthening him. For Ahaz took a portion from the house of the Lord and the house of the king and of the princes, and gave tribute to the king of Assyria, but it did not help him. And so we get a little more detail about what Ahaz did here in 2 Kings. That Ahaz took wealth from the temple and from the people of Judah and to send to the king of Assyria when he asked for help. And he was paying off the king and asking him to deliver him from Israel and Syria. But the king of Assyria, he did come down and fight against Syria and Israel. But once he subdued them, he didn't stop there. He also came down and subdued Ahaz and Judah as well. And so Ahaz put his faith in the king of Assyria, but it failed him. The king exerted his power over Ahaz rather than supporting him, and it ended up making Judah even weaker. Verse 22. In the time of his distress, he became yet more faithless to the Lord, this same King Ahaz. Now, this is a sad statement, but this is the problem here. He didn't listen to God. With all of this happening, Ahaz disobeys even more. He didn't learn his lesson. Everything that's happened was meant to drive him back to God. But he refused God, and he delved even deeper into sin. What did he do? Well, we're told here in verses 23 through 25. For he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus that had defeated him, and said, because the gods of the kings of Syria helped them, I will sacrifice to them, that they may help me. But they were the ruin of him and of all Israel. And Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God and cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. And he shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. And he made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah, he made high places to make offerings to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his fathers. So when Ahaz was defeated by Syria, he assumed, well, their gods must be stronger than mine. And so he made the practical but sinful decision to worship them. In other words, he changed gods because he thought they could help him even more. Of course, he didn't get the results that he had hoped for because he ignored and then abandoned the true God and put his trust in false gods who could do nothing. Now again, 2 Kings gives us a little more detail about Ahaz. And after the Assyrians defeated Syria, Ahaz goes to Damascus, the capital of Syria. And while there, he sees the altar there, and he has a replica of it made in Judah, so he can worship the gods of Damascus at home. Now, this may have been what Chronicles was talking about, or it may have been a second change of gods, because at this time, Syria had then been defeated, and Syria and their gods had been defeated by Assyria. And so this may have been an altar to the Assyrians' God. But what we see here is that he's willing to shift his allegiance to whoever he thinks will give him more. But we will see here that Ahaz also, he shuts the doors of God's temple in Jerusalem. In other words, he's saying, don't worship God. Worship these false gods. And he takes things that were dedicated to God and dedicated for use in his worship. And Ahaz has them cut up and used as materials to make his pagan altars. And he builds altars all over Jerusalem and in all the cities of Judah to these false gods. He did the exact opposite of what he was supposed to do as king in Israel. He was to lead the people in worshiping the true God. But instead, he has led people away from God. And in doing all of this, he provoked God to anger. Ahaz has made things worse. Verse 26. Now the rest of his acts and all his ways from first to last, behold, they are written in the book of the king of Judah and Israel. And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city in Jerusalem, for they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. And Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. So he dies, and he's buried, but not with the other kings. And this is actually good news, because this tells us that the people of Judah, they didn't approve of his godless lifestyle. They didn't approve of what he did, and they didn't give him the honor of being buried with the other Davidic kings. Let me finish this by saying this. Don't be like Ahaz. Now, that statement could be applied in many ways, but let me apply it this way. When God disciplines you, take notice of it and turn from your sin and turn to God. If you're not obeying God and your life is a mess, or if you're facing struggle after struggle after struggle, maybe God is trying to teach you something. Go to him. Humble yourself. Confess your sin. And get right with him. And then look to him for help. If you're a child of God, but you're not being faithful to him, you should expect to be disciplined. Because God's word says that he disciplines those he loves. Don't turn further away from him, but turn to him. Get close to him and live to please him and to honor him. Don't let the winds of the world, the winds of the world's ways, blow you into a corner and trap you in meaningless activity. Don't ignore God or turn away from him and chase after other things. You'll find that they don't deliver on their promises. You won't get what you really need. Determine to follow Jesus. Be purposeful to live for God's glory. Because truly, there is no better way. There is no better life than living in right fellowship with God.